Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
On today's episode, we're continuing our month-long Halloween season discussion on scary movies, with a rundown of our favorite horror movies of the year, from modern takes on the universal monsters of old to a supernatural thriller shot entirely on Zoom.
Welcome to Film Club.
Okay, Katie, so it's still October, still in the middle of the spooky month of the year.
Yeah, we've got a long one this year. Five weeks.
5 weeks and 5 episodes of Film Club. So
Indeed.
Yeah. This is our 4th episode. We've been talking all month about scary movies and about horror. October, of course, is towards the end of the year, and what we're coming after Halloween is over, we're going to be kind of moving into more into the holiday season and the last 2 months of the year, which here at the AV Club means that we're going to be talking about some of our favorite movies of the year. And we're going to be moving into that best of period that we go through every year that is super exciting, but also this basically this sprint to the finish line where we're just trying to see as much as possible, to be as accurate as we can about what our favorites of the year were.
Really, the second half of the year, I feel it can be a marathon because we'll do the week that we do every year, like 1999 week, 2000 week, and so you catch up for that, and you do the rest of the year so far, and then it's festival season, and then it's Halloween, and then it's best of the year. There's like a theme to every month of the back half of the year for film critics, I think.
For sure, and I'll say this too, that I every year I sort of end up looking forward to the first couple months of the year, the first few months of the year, because I don't yet feel obligated to start catching up on everything, like on new releases, basically, that came out throughout the year yet. And I can actually use that period of time to see older movies that I've never seen, or just to catch up on classics, or to,
maybe watch some TV.
Maybe watch some TV. Maybe just watch some movies for fun. But so every year we do our best movies of the year list, which is a multiple contributors pitch in on that, and we end up ranking 20 to 25 of the best movies of the year. And we have other features that we run, like best scenes of the year as well. We do a worst of list usually, which, side note, we're still kind of trying to figure out if we're going to do that this year, because there's a part of me that thinks that maybe this year was bad enough that we don't need a worst of list. But on the other hand, as you know, as I know, there's also been a lot of shit released this year. But one thing that we don't generally do at the AV Club is we don't do lists of we don't break down the best movies of the year by genre or anything. You won't see on the site. You'll never see something on the site like the best comedies of the year or the best dramas of the year, the best musicals, whatever. We just don't break it down that specifically on the site. Which sort of gives us a unique opportunity on the show, which is that we can do something that we're not going to do at the end of the year, which is we can talk about our favorite horror movies of the year specifically.
This is something that I'll maybe do just for my own edification on Letterboxd or Twitter or whatever. But yeah, it's definitely not something we do separately on the site. And I will say horror movies will make it on our, best of the year in general list. We're not too snobbish in that way.
They will, that's true. But there are a lot of films, I think, when it comes down to it, some of our favorite horror films of the year sometimes won't make it onto the list. So this sort of gives us an opportunity to talk about those movies. And I know that the year is not over yet, and we could see over November, December, we could see some good horror films. I know there's one that's opening in early November that you're a fan of called The Dark and the Wicked. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. That one really lives up to its title.
Okay. Well, so, that opens in early November, so we won't be talking about that today necessarily. But anything, there could be some good stuff that opens between now and the end of the year, some good horror films. So
absolutely.
Consider this a preemptive disclaimer that this is sort of the best horror movies of the year as of mid-October,
Absolutely. And there's been a lot of horror movies coming out this October, more than usual, it feels like. Although I don't have any, empirical data on that. And it's also interesting considering, 2020 and everything that's happened to think about what might have been, because by this point in the year, if the theatrical calendar had held, we would have seen Candyman and Halloween Kills by now.
That's true. Yep. The two of the bigger horror movies scheduled for the year would definitely be out. And there'd be others too. That movie Antlers that was supposed to come out in the spring would be out. A Quiet Place 2 would have come out, depending if you think that's horror or not, sort of toes a certain line.
Absolutely.
I mean, the fact of the matter is that people, this time of year, people spend a lot of their time watching horror movies. There is an uptick in the amount that people are watching. And, we all go back to these classics that we see that we watch every year. We have these staples of the season that we watch. But at a certain point, how many times can you watch The Exorcist? How many times can you watch Halloween? So it is useful I think, to remember that there are good horror movies being made pretty much constantly. Some would say we're living in a modern renaissance of them. And I think that this year there's been plenty this year that's been pretty strong, honestly. And if you are, so consider this episode a guide to, if you're really looking for some new horror movies to watch this year, we got your back on that one, and we're going to talk about, each of us are going to talk about our 5 favorite horror movies of the year. And I believe that we only have one overlap in that department.
Yes, we have one strong consensus pick that neither of us were really willing to take off of our list.
Yeah. So let's start with that. Some would probably, at least in turn, if you went to Rotten Tomatoes and you plugged in, best horror movies of the year, and they gave you the aggregate rankings of the horror films that came out this year based on Rotten Tomatoes score, an imperfect metric, but at least giving you some sense of how critical consensus has formed around a film. I suspect that the number one of the year, at least in terms of movies seen by a large number of critics and by audiences, would probably be The Invisible Man.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think it is important to distinguish the wide release of that film and the fact that a large number of critics who don't write for genre-specific sites saw it, because sometimes you'll have horror movies that'll have perfect Rotten Tomatoes scores, but then you look and it's only been covered by the genre press.
That's very true. Yep. But The Invisible Man was kind of honestly, one of the big... When the dust clears at the end of this year, it's going to look like one of the bigger theatrical hits of the year, simply by virtue of being one of the only ones, because it opened actually right before COVID shut everything down. So it came out at the end of February, and it got a couple weeks of runway before everything shut down. And I actually ended up seeing it about a week after release on IMAX. It was one of the last things I saw in a theater before I couldn't see anything again. We've talked a lot about this film already on the site and on this podcast. You and Ignati did an episode on it, a full episode of Film Club on it, when the movie opened in February. And when we did our mid-year awards in July, when we were talking about some of our, we were basically talking about some of our favorite movies of the year so far. The Invisible Man came up in terms of Elizabeth Moss, but I do think this thing is going to endure. I think it's a really strong piece of filmmaking, and it kind of takes the yuppie in peril thriller that was so big in the late 80s and early 90s, and gives it this and basically puts a classic Universal monster into that scenario, and ends up turning The Invisible Man, that classic story, into kind of a gaslighting thriller in a way.
Yeah, and another thing I liked about it, speaking of kind of playing on different genres and putting them in the Universal mold, I felt like there was also a bit of a superhero, I guess you could call it satire in here, and making The Invisible Man sort of like an evil version of Iron Man.
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's kind of a tech bro in a way. He's kind of an Elon Musk type figure, He's like somebody who has probably been called a genius before because of his work in scientific in the scientific field, but it really gets into a strain of toxic masculinity that sometimes runs wild in those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with what you said about the craft of this film. It's really cool. Lee Whannell, the director, he started off as a screenwriter, worked with James Wan a lot back when they were both starting out. And he's kind of made his own name as a director. He did the film Upgrade, which I think was 2 years ago, which is another solid but lower budget sort of, that one's more of a sci-fi thriller. But he, he really has a very strong grasp on fundamentals, which, as we discussed last week, is super important when in genre work.
Yeah, he's really good with space. I think he really knows how to play with tension and how to weaponize space. And this is a movie where, I mean, when your villain is when your villain is invisible, you have to do things to imply his presence. Rather than simply, like he's a monster that we're not horrified to look at because we can't see him. So the movie has to do things with his absence that is scary, and it'll be things like he'll just like lock onto a chair that we're fairly certain he's in and just build suspense from that. And this movie does have like kind of a powerhouse final act where it goes into kind of full action thriller mode. But I honestly think it works best when it's being kind of as I said, sort of a gaslighting thriller where we know that something is really happening to our main character, played by Elizabeth Moss, but everyone in the heroine's world doesn't necessarily know. They just think she's kind of having a meltdown.
Yeah, and I think some of that can be attributed to the strength of Elizabeth Moss's performance as well, because it is really difficult to act against something that isn't actually there. And she does a great job.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's another thing about not having... When you can't see your monster, you need an actor who can kind of convey the power and the fright of that monster on her lonesome. And it's such a volcanic performance in some ways. I actually do think it's one of the better performances of the year. And would love to see her in that conversation, even if the movie is, a genre film.
So my next pick, Alex, is one that is also a bit of a genre bender. This one you would call a sci-fi horror hybrid, which I really enjoyed. We discussed this briefly when you published your review, but a lot of the time sci-fi is a very cold, cerebral type of genre, which is cool. That's its own thing. But this one is a very visceral, bloody, violent, shocking take on sci-fi, and that is Possessor, which is being advertised as Possessor Uncut, which, as we've discussed before, not sure why it's marketed as uncut, because it hasn't been released cut. So I'm not sure why they felt the need to make
It's a marketing ploy, I think, entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's them saying, like, we need to make this thing seem more dangerous, and we need to... but I will say this. I mean... the violence in this movie is
really
very harsh.
Bloody.
Yeah. So maybe it's not such a bad thing that there's a warning to people. Like maybe the uncut does supply people with a proper warning about how extreme the violence in this gets at times.
Yeah. That old video nasty thing where they put it right there on the box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it ends up doubling as both like a marketing ploy and a proper disclaimer in a way,
So the plot of Possessor is not entirely invented from whole cloth. There have been movies like this before, like the Cell movies that are sort of like adventure set inside someone's mind. And it also incorporates elements of the body swap idea, which is often done as comedy, actually. But in this one, it's Andrea Riseborough plays an assassin. Her name is Tasia Voss, and she's this famous assassin who works with this sort of clandestine agency that has a device where she can put her consciousness into someone else's body and kill someone in that other person's body, making it, she gets away with murder constantly. And the film kind of follows her on a couple missions. The opening scene is this big, bombastic, very violent set piece where we see Tasia carrying out a job. And then, but most of it revolves around another job where she goes into the body of Christopher Abbott, who's becoming, I guess, he's becoming a pretty popular genre player. He's done a lot of genre movies in the past few years. He kind of looks like the actor who plays Jon Snow, if you're not familiar with him.
Oh, okay, I can see it.
He looks like Jon Snow from Game of Thrones, and he's been in a lot of genre stuff. He was in It Comes at Night, which we discussed in our Elevated Horror episode. He was in Piercing, which comes from Nicholas Pesky, director of Ides My Mother. He's in a movie called Black Bear that it's not out just yet. It's on the festival circuit now. And then he's in Possessor, too. He must have a fondness for this show.
Yeah. I think he's a very good actor, and I think he's terrific in this because he kind of has to do. It's kind of a dual role in a way because, as you said, the movie is about he is this. He's a boyfriend of. He's the boyfriend of the daughter of the head of this corporation, basically. The movie is a lot about corporate espionage. That's a lot of her jobs. A lot of the main characters' assassination jobs are like killing heads of sort of barons of industry, that sort of thing. And Abbott just plays this unlucky boyfriend of who is like sort of tangentially related to this empire. But so a lot of the movie is Riseborough's character sort of occupying his skin. She's in his body. So we're seeing him sort of play her as him. But then we also get scenes where we see him as himself. So it's this kind of remarkable dual performance. And he's also he really captures the dislocation of somebody who is not in their proper body, you know?
Yeah, and Andrea Riseborough is a great performer too. I love her in pretty much everything she's in. She's great. She was great in the Waco miniseries. If you watch that, the TV miniseries,
I didn't see that,
and she's really good in it. But one of the coolest things about this movie, like you said, is the dual identity thing. And there's a moment, so it's a woman possessing a man's body, and there's like the closest thing that comes to a comedic moment in this very serious movie is when she wakes up as a man and is like, a penis. Interesting. But things get very psychedelic as the two of them sort of battle for his consciousness and really intense. And I think here, body horror is the main vehicle of horror in this one. And that leads me to note that this film is directed by Brandon Cronenberg, son of David Cronenberg, who is really doing his family name proud. I'm all about a Cronenberg dynasty of fucked up body horror movies. I'm for it.
Yeah, I mean, like Cronenberg is his father's work is one of the many influences on this film. I think that there's a ton of other, there's a little Ghost in the Shell in this. I think there's a little Under the Skin. I think there's a lot of different movies are sort of have been mixed into the alchemy of this film. I dig this movie a lot. I think it's really stylish and pretty gripping for the most part. My only real complaint about it, honestly, is that I feel on some level that its ideas, that some of its sort of sci-fi premise is so strong in terms of what it's saying about identity that there were moments in the film where I felt like Cronenberg going for a gnarly gore shot, or him veering it off into, honestly, the closer it got to horror, the more I sort of felt like he was neglecting some of the more interesting cerebral stuff that's going on in this film.
See, that's interesting because, like I said up top, what I liked about this film is that it is so visceral.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really refreshing take on the genre. And also, I have no problem with a film leaving things on the table for you to think about later.
Yeah, that's true. I do really like the note that this film ends on, and there's a really damning thing that it says. As a character study, I think this is a really troubling piece of work, even besides its gore, you know?
Yeah, its implications about like the idea, sort of like the old philosophical question of like the terror of being trapped inside one consciousness or inside a body is very much present in this film.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to talk about another one of my favorites, and that is Gretel and Hansel. Now, obviously, that's a take on the classic story of the two young children the two kids who walk through the woods and find a witch in the woods, and who lives in a house made of candy. And I assume you know the story. Most people do. I assume most of our listeners will know that story.
The Grimm fairy tale.
Yep, exactly. And the film is directed by Oz Perkins, who we actually recently talked about on our Elevated Horror episode. of the podcast.
Yeah, he's another favorite around these parts.
He is, yeah, and he's the son of Anthony Perkins, who played Norman Bates. At a certain point, I'm going to stop referring to him that way because I think he's establishing his own career. But it does seem a little relevant, that the son of Norman Bates has become such an accomplished horror filmmaker.
Sure. I mean, yeah, like I don't mean to denigrate Brandon Cronenberg by mentioning, him being part of a family dynasty, but it is an interesting fact.
Yeah, for sure.
It reflects on their work
a
little bit.
Yep. So what Perkins does, I mean, beyond just sort of expanding Hansel and Gretel into expanding it to feature length, is that he sort of, I mean, for one thing, he gives this thing this kind of grimy period piece authenticity. I mean, this is a movie that sort of revels in its production design. It's a beautifully art directed film, for one thing, and sort of situates this fairy tale in something resembling the real past, one might say, even though we're dealing with the story of a witch, obviously. But I think also what this film does is that this is actually a movie that I think is more interested in its ideas than it is probably in sort of contrast to Possessor. You could say I think this is a movie that is way more interested in its ideas than it is in delivering the kind of expected multiplex jolts. You know what I mean?
Interesting, because I thought it was I thought its main focus was on aesthetics. This is a really beautiful film, and the combination of elements in it is really cool, I thought. The best way I can think to describe it, I think I put this in the review, is that it's Pennsylvania Dutch meets Alejandro Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain. Like, that's basically what the look of the film is. Yeah. It's this sort of like folk art occultism that is a really, really striking. And I thought the editing in this film was good too.
Yeah.
I felt like this film was a really great example of sustained atmosphere and tension, which, as we discussed last week, is also difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, Perkins is a master of that, I think. I mean, his other two films, The Blackcoat's Daughter and I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House, are basically exercises in sustained unease, I mean, they basically are about how much anxiety can we provoke in the audience just with prolonging the scares and with just creating this kind of oppressive mood of doom, and
it's doom, but it's not like this movie does have an atmosphere of doom, but I guess I'll do a little bit of a spoiler alert here and say that it also shares some characteristics with The Witch, in that it ultimately views witchcraft as a potential source of liberation as well as terror.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about with it being interesting in its ideas. I think there actually is a real discussion going on under the surface of this movie. An AB Club contributor, Charles Bramesco, said that what he thought the film was really about was kind of the clash between different waves of feminism, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. With the witch in the film, played by Alice Krieg, sort of representing this kind of first wave idea of feminism, and our heroine, Gretel, played by Sophia Lillis, is sort of represents an evolving understanding of what that means. And
I'd say second and third, but the point is taken.
Right. And I just found it fascinating to see how much Perkins cares about that particular element of this story, and how little he actually ultimately cares about scares. And I know that might put some people off. I'm also not arguing that this thing isn't creepy in its own right, because I think it is very creepy.
It really is.
But it's not a roller coaster ride. It really is interested in atmosphere and in this dynamic between these characters. And I was honestly very curious to see what this would be like, because Perkins' earlier work was all extremely like limited budget, independent films for sure. And this was his entryway into studio filmmaking. And I think it's very cool that he managed to make a horror film that still feels entirely like his own, and one that is still sort of hung up on his particular preoccupations, that doesn't ever feel like it's pandering. I can see why the movie wasn't a huge hit, honestly, but I am impressed by the degree to which it feels like an expression of his personal interests with a slightly larger budget.
Yeah, I also felt that it was a really good example of like an auteur taking on a larger budget studio film and not losing themselves in the process. And actually, like, this is not to say that adults could not enjoy this film. I think, in fact, adults would enjoy this film the most. But I think that this film actually would serve as a really great introduction to the more art house side of horror for maybe like teenagers, younger teenagers, because it does straddle those two styles of filmmaking.
Well, and honestly, there is something in it thematically, too, that I think might be appealing to teenagers, in that it is about somebody, I mean, basically it is about Gretel sort of finding her way, her place in the world, and what she wants her life to be, and what she wants the future to be, and her kind of navigating a world of, again, we'll talk about toxic masculinity, but there's a little bit of that in this as well, you know?
Yeah. And like we were saying before, it does have that message of blasphemous liberation, which I always love. Love a good dancing around the bonfire sort of theme. So I'm going to go with another film next that I think also straddles the line between sort of what you might call high-mind elevated, which is, in this case, is more of a high-minded concept with really kind of visceral scares, and that is His House, which is a British haunted house movie, which is actually coming out on Netflix on Halloween. So this one, I'm bending the rules just a little bit because it's out next week, but it's close enough, I felt. And this one, it's about it answers the question that always comes up in haunted house movies of why don't they leave the house? And in this film, the answer is because they are refugees from Sudan, and they have been assigned this housing by a government agency, and they literally have nowhere else to go. It's either this or go back to the detention facility that they were in before. And the house is actually, not haunted by, the ghost of an old British racist or anything like that. It's haunted by a spirit back from their home country, which is sort of reminding them of the desperate and one could even say immoral things they had to do in order to get out.
That sounds awesome. I have not seen this film yet. I remember it was very well received at Sundance. It was part of the midnight slate at Sundance. And so you said that there are some big scares in this as well, though?
This one gets really intense, and it's kind of cool. This one starts off, with the setup and everything, but then it gets really intense in the middle. It's got a couple of really intense scare scenes, and then it backs off and relieves the tension for a little bit with a sort of gaslighting passage, and then it goes really intense again at the end. It sort of ebbs and flows with these really like beautifully filmed, striking, intense scare scenes. And this one, I actually won't give away what happens because it's genuinely kind of shocking. Okay. And also, but the thing that is the most striking about this movie to me is, we've talked before about Toni Collette and how she gave this amazing performance in Hereditary, but it wasn't acknowledged by any of the awards bodies because it was a horror movie. I think there's a similar situation. I'm predicting it. Maybe, awards will be better than this time. But Wunmi Mosaku, who she plays the female lead, she's also on Lovecraft Country on HBO. She gives a fantastic performance in this. She's really, really, really good in this movie. There's like an extended flashback in the middle where she's really, really good. It's the best performance, possibly better than Elizabeth Moss and Elizabeth Mann. It's definitely one of the best performances I've seen in a horror movie this year.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, she's really good.
Going on my queue then. You said it's on Netflix at the end of the month? Halloween?
October 31st.
Nice.
Halloween is
Cool.
premiering on Netflix. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so my next pick is this film called The Wolf of Snow Hollow. And this, in many respects, is I think maybe you're seeing a pattern with some of our picks here, in that some of them are not just horror films; they're doing other things. And in a lot of respects, this one is this one is definitely a hybrid too. It's as much a comedy as a horror film, although of maybe a slightly drier sensibility than you might expect from your average horror comedy. It's written, directed, and stars Jim Cummings, who made a film a couple years ago that I really liked called Thunder Road.
I love that movie too.
Quite good.
I really like that movie.
Very strong film. Kind of a cringe comedy about this police officer, this small town police officer who's having a meltdown. And Cummings plays a kind of similar character, honestly, in The Wolf of Snow Hollow. He is the son of the sheriff, played by Robert Forster, the late Robert Forster. This is actually his last screen appearance.
Oh, R.I.P.
Yeah, R.I.P. Quite good in this, by the way. Kind of a nice send off to him in a lot of ways.
Good.
Yeah, but Cummings plays his son, and he is a recovering alcoholic and somebody who has definitely some anger control issues. And he is thrust into the middle of this investigation. There are a series of killings in their small, snowy Utah community, and the culprit appears to be a werewolf. And Cummings' character, his name's John Marshall, does not want to believe that it's a werewolf, obviously. And the film operates in a really unusual way in some respects, in that I mean, there are sequences in this that are played for straight horror. I mean, there is, where people are being stalked and killed by a werewolf. But a lot of it, some of it plays like a police procedural. I mean, we're seeing there's almost a Zodiac quality to portions of this film, where we're seeing people sort of go to libraries and research things, and it sort of gets us into the nitty gritty of their investigation.
Oh my God. The library scene where they check out the books on the occult is one of my favorite kinds of horror movie scenes. I love the library scene where they check out all the books on witchcraft and they flip open to the page as the exact demon that's bothering them. Oh,
well, there's a variation of that in this, where he just basically is at the library looking at these books about werewolves. Basically, he's like reading up on werewolf mythology. But the thing about it is that he's kind of inserted this intrinsically tragicomic figure in the middle of this story. Like, I could see it's possible to imagine a movie that is both a police procedural and a werewolf movie. This to that equation, this one adds I guess what's becoming quickly a classic Jim Cummings character, which is this guy who is just on the edge of his feelings at all times. And if you saw Thunder Road, his character in this isn't radically different from that one, but it's in a slightly different comic register. He is just somebody who is constantly on the verge of flipping out about something. And I was blown away by the filmmaking too. I think he's really coming into his own as a director, and this does some really smart things with editing and with montage, and the way that he will often parallel the attack scenes with our main character sort of bumbling through his state of constant suppressed rage in the investigation. It's a really funny and ultimately kind of intoxicating movie, one that I do think still kind of works as horror in its own right too.
I'm really excited to see this movie. This is one I haven't had a chance to see yet. I'm saving it. I'm gonna have a double feature of this and Hubie Halloween.
That's crazy, because that is what I did last weekend.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God, I'm saving it for this weekend. That's so
I did
fun.
that exact same double feature last weekend.
Okay, so with the knowledge, I haven't seen this yet. What I'm hearing you describe sort of sounds like Paul Schrader meets Joe Dante. Is that crazy off base?
Well, you're missing a comic aspect of it, you know.
Okay.
Schrader is very serious, you know.
Right. But Joe Dante can be funny.
That's true. Joe Dante can be very funny, actually. So maybe that's not so off base. I think what it comes down to, though, is that Cummings as a writer director has such a distinct voice. And a lot of it does come down to the fact that so far he's starred in his own films, but he brings this very unique comic flavor that never feels like it's pushing the jokes too much, where a lot of it really just comes down to the anxiety and the impulse control issues of his characters. There's just a lot of really smart visual choices in the film too. There's this reoccurring shot of during some of there are a lot of scenes in this movie are montages, and there's this reoccurring shot that keeps showing up where he's giving us this slow zoom into a microwave that's in the main character's kitchen. Just this whole stove set up with a microwave above it, and when he finally reveals what that's about, it's a really strong choice.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to this one. My next choice is one that was a divisive film. Some people really find this film intolerable, but I found it intriguing and engrossing, and it is She Dies Tomorrow. Amy Seimetz's, I guess you could call it a psychological horror film. It's the sort of monster in it is very abstract. The monster in it is essentially the fear of death. This film premiered at the virtual South by Southwest Film Festival, which is where I saw it, and then came out theatrically back in August. It's out now. And so basically, it opens with this long sequence where we see the main character is played by Caitlin Shield, kind of just puttering around this house that's full of unpacked boxes and getting drunk by herself and playing classical music very, very loudly on the stereo. And you kind of wonder what's going on with her. And then and then her friend, played by Jane Addams, shows up and kind of gives her some tough love for falling off the wagon. So we find out that she's an alcoholic. And then she turns to her friend and says, I think I want to be made into a leather jacket. And that's when you're like, okay, this movie is really going to give us something different. And so in the film, what happens is you're basically visited by these bright colored lights, that have this saturated Dario Argento kind of effect and loud music, and you're just transfixed with horror. And it's almost like someone is seeing an alien almost. It kind of reminds me of like someone being abducted by aliens where they say they're frozen in the tractor beam or whatever. And then after that, you become just consumed with this feeling that for sure you're gonna die the next day, and it spreads like a virus throughout everyone who encounters it. And for that reason, I think it was labeled as a bit of a pandemic horror film.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely this sense of of this anxiety that's crept into everyone's normal lives suddenly. Seimetz introduces a number of the movie kind of has this baton-like structure where we're following the spread of this thing to new characters constantly. We'll meet a new character, then suddenly we're sharing their their space and we're in their lives. And so the structure of the movie is actually a bit like the spread of a virus in some respects. Only in this case, the virus is a kind of a mysterious existential despair.
Yeah.
I loved this thing in terms of I think the conceit is great. And I think it's stylishly made in a lot of respects. I sort of it's very unconventional in its period as a horror movie. I think this thing. One reason I think this movie has been divisive is that I do think it does not deliver the exact pacing that one might expect from a normal, quote unquote, normal horror movie.
Sure.
It's not a long film, but it takes a while to even figure out what is wrong and what's going on.
Yeah, that first sequence I was describing is quite long. I think it's 15 or 20 minutes of a 90-ish minute movie.
Yeah. And there is a little bit of very, very dark comedy in it too, in terms of the way that these characters who are rationally resisting the insane behavior of their friends, neighbors, and sometimes patients will suddenly catch this despair that they have. And I do very much understand people thinking of this as a pandemic horror movie, because I think it does sort of capture, one might say very accidentally, it does capture the general feeling of fear and mortality that we're all experiencing right now, that we've been experiencing for months now.
Yeah, it's this sort of sudden, unavoidable command that you face your own death. You just have to look at it in the eye and you can't look away. And that aspect, I do see why it's called a pandemic horror film, even though it's obviously not made with the pandemic in mind, because it was supposed to premiere at South by, which was at the very beginning of the pandemic. So it was obviously completed long before that happened. And I like the style of the film, particularly in the way it does the horror, because it's very Baroque almost. Like, it's very colorful and operatic and in your face and a lot of loud music and bright colors, but it's also very abstract, which I thought was a cool combination.
Cool. Yeah. I didn't love this one, to be honest, but even though I can sort of abstractly understand you love it and why a lot of people, I mean, we're sitting here talking about the ways in which it feels timely, and I do think the premise is very creepy, and I kind of have a hard time putting my finger on exactly why it left me a little cold. I think maybe because the film actually erects a little bit of distance between itself and the despair that these characters have.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. It has a dissociative quality, which also, is sort of as one might put it, a pandemic mood.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's very true, actually. Yeah. I just sort of watching it, I sort of kept waiting for somebody to have the reaction, to have a real panic attack about this. And the entire film is more about, it's almost a sense of resignation that comes over everyone.
Yeah.
I'm
totally
going to die tomorrow, and I've accepted that, and I just fall into this general despair. I think those looking for a horror movie that's going to as with several of the films we've picked today, this thing is not a roller coaster ride.
No. Maybe at the end we can say which films are the whole roller coaster rides. Maybe we could.
I'm going to save mine for last, actually. I'm going to save mine for last.
Okay, cool.
I mean, The Invisible Man is. I mean, let's be real. The Invisible Man is an intense film in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and his house is too. His house is very scary in parts.
Okay, so I'm gonna another one of my picks would be The Lodge. And this is another film we've talked about.
Hey,
before.
Speaking of chili, but
yeah, very good. It is definitely it's a winter film. It's actually set over Christmas, in fact. And this is very much a movie that I think understands its placement in the ongoing elevated horror conversation. I think it's a film that's been made with an understanding of the current popularity and hype surrounding those movies. It's the same team of filmmakers who did Good Night Mommy. If you've ever seen that one, it's an Austrian pair of filmmakers, Severin Fiala and Veronica Franz. And it's in some respects it's very similar to that movie in that the basic setup is two children basically locked in an isolated setting with a female parental figure of some sort. And in this case, that parental figure is the new girlfriend of their father. And I won't say, there is an inciting incident in this film that I will not spoil, even though it happens very early in the movie. It's sort of a cruel shock that happens that sort of tosses, like a lot of elevated horror films, sort of pushes this one into the realm of tragedy as well, and into the realm of post-traumatic stress. But most of the movie takes place at the family cabin, which is in a kind of remote mountain area, and these two kids, one of them grade school age, the other one like maybe slightly older, maybe 13 or something, played by Jaden Martell from the It movies. And they're sort of snowed in with the girlfriend of their father, who they have largely they're not warming to at all, no pun intended. They've sort of rejected her presence in their life, and the movie is this sort of immaculate slow burn about the tension that develops between them. And I think it's in terms of atmosphere, I think it's pretty masterfully put together. I think it creates this kind of religious terror.
The religious element is one of the most interesting things about this film, I think.
Yeah, because the girlfriend is played by Riley Keough, and she is the survivor of a cult that her father was the leader of, like a suicide cult, who basically every member of the cult killed themselves. She's the lone survivor of it, and that becomes an element that is very much that comes to the forefront more and more as the movie progresses. And yeah, I mean, I have my issues with this film. I think you do too, if I recall.
I'm not super hot on this film. Once again, no pun intended. Sorry, I'll stop. I think cruel is a great way to describe this film. This film was very cruel in what it does to its characters and what it does to the audience. It's brutal. Like there's a turn of the screw kind of element to it, which is really interesting. But also the way it plays out is so calculated and cruel and brutal. And my issue with it is more that I feel that it is self-consciously trying to kind of catch the elevated horror wave, which I didn't think these directors really had to do because they already made Goodnight Mommy. And so I'm not sure what they're trying to prove with this film. Like, it's not like I felt like they really felt like they had something to say so much as they were like, oh, you like emotional shocks, huh? Well, here we go. But I will agree that it is masterfully made, even if it felt a little bit hollow in terms of, like just kind of what the directors were trying to get at by making it, I guess. I felt there was a bit of a hollowness in there.
Okay. My objection to the film, and again, this is a movie I'm recommending it. I mostly quite like this film. My only real objection to it is that I think that some of what happens in it is a bit improbable. And I can't say...
Well, that too, but I wasn't going to say that because it's spoilery.
I can't say much more about that, honestly.
Yeah, like you really will ruin the movie.
I will. Like Goodnight Mommy, this is a film that has some twists and turns, and I think there is an element of this that I found that will require quite a large suspension of disbelief, I think, in a way that is not necessarily immediately clear. But I kind of admired its... I actually, that cruelty you're talking about, I sort of admired about this, because this is definitely a film about that matches its icy weather with some really, really strong resentment from these characters.
Yeah,
and, that emotional, that sort of emotional bedrock that is beneath this expanding dread that the film lives on, I found to be unsettling.
Yeah, and I think that the cinematography in this movie was great, and a lot of the compositions really enhanced both the feeling of dread and kind of the cold cruelty of it is kind of matched by those really bleak winter landscapes.
Yeah.
Okay. So we were talking about films just now that are thrill rides or not thrill rides. And my last pick for this list is one that is a total thrill ride and one that I was not expecting to, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't expecting this movie to be very good. Simply because it was made on Zoom during quarantine, and that is Host, a film that came out on Shudder over the summer. It was filmed after the lockdown restrictions came down, so every actor was basically alone in their apartment while they were filming. And the director is Rob Savage, British. It's a British film. And, they really managed to pull off just a good old-fashioned jump scare roller coaster ride with some pretty cool, some pretty neat tricks in it. There's one effect in this film that I really have no idea how they pulled it off. I really don't know. There's it's a running bit that goes throughout the film where one of the characters she keeps using like Snapchat filters on her face while she's talking just to, make jokes just to be silly. And there's one point where, there's like this entity that's terrorizing them. And at one point you see the filter just floating by itself in the room. Like the entity has the Snapchat filter on its face. And I don't know how they did it. And it sounds silly. The whole concept sounds silly because the basic concept is this group of friends is doing a seance over Zoom for something to do during the quarantine. But it really, it works. I don't know. It's just, really just simple, savage, and effective. I really gotta give Rob Savage, once again, I gotta give him credit for pulling this off, man, because if you had asked me at the beginning of the quarantine, hey, would you like to watch a Zoom horror movie? I would have said, absolutely not. Are you kidding?
And I haven't seen this one yet myself, although I'm very interested in seeing it. To what degree does this recall Unfriended? Because that's what I thought of when I first heard about it.
To a degree. I think it does belong in that screen life genre of movies. I would classify it as one of those, but it is a little different in the sense that it's just Zoom. Most of the screen life movies will incorporate multiple platforms, but this one is just Zoom. It doesn't have chat running down the side of the screen or anything like that.
Because I love Unfriended. I think Unfriended is pretty great, actually, and I think a lot of that is the way that it uses kind of the basic UI programs and the sort of basics of everyday computing as tools of inducing fear. I think it's really effective in that respect. Actually, when I saw Unfriended, I thought this is a radical new kind of filmmaking. That's what I thought when I watched it.
Yeah, this one is more of a sort of classic haunted house style, like a door will slam shut with a loud bang, that sort of thing. It's more those types of scares delivered in a contemporary format.
Got it. Okay, so the last of my picks for the best horror movies of the year is a film called Alone, which is a super generic title for a horror movie. There are apparently 2 other films even this year called Alone. It's a very, very generic title, but not a super generic movie. And it's directed by John Himes, who is a kind of DTV action specialist. He made his career on a couple of the later Universal Soldier direct-to-video installments, one of the later sequels.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and sort of instantly gained a following among those who like really stylish, surreal, direct sort of DTV action. And Alone is not quite as psychedelic as those films, particularly the most recent one. It's actually much more sort of a bare bones thriller exercise in some respects. And that's kind of what I admire so much about it. I mean, this one is, I think last week we talked a little bit about the distinction between horror and thriller. And I think you could probably make the case that this is just a straight thriller for how much it foregrounds suspense more than anything else. But I thought a lot of some of the sort of classics of some classic films in the horror genre, things like Duel, like Steven Spielberg's Duel, and Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. I think this has that level of purity to its setup. It wastes no time whatsoever. It's basically about a woman who is moving back in with her parents for reasons that become clear as the movie goes on. But she's driving. She's sort of on a long drive, and she starts to be harassed by this man in another vehicle who she keeps running into on the road. And I won't say much more about it. The movie is 98 minutes. It's very short, and it really wastes so little time on anything that's not pure suspense. I mean, like she meets this driver within 5 to 10 minutes into the movie, probably 5 minutes, honestly, and the movie just does not let up from there. It becomes a real ordeal for her. And I was just, for one thing, I was impressed by the filmmaking, which I thought was very formally accomplished in terms of composition, in terms of building suspense. And I was just impressed by how much this thing, it's just like this lean little suspense contraption that pushes like we're sort of watching a woman basically try to escape somebody, and it just keeps like her ordeal. It just keeps hitting us with more and more complications, one might say.
Yeah, this movie also, I saw this one as well, and I also admired the craft. I thought it was very, very lean and Carpenter-esque, like you said. I think that is the best sort of comparison to draw there. And it is also effective. I will say this movie, there's a part in the middle of it that made me really uncomfortable. And that is, I will actually, I mean, that you could say is a credit to the direction, and that it's really, really, it's like serial killer kind of stuff, You said you're not going to say too much, but I'll say a little bit. There's a part where she's chained in this guy's basement, and he's kind of torturing her. And that's the part that made me, I found it really unsettling, maybe a little bit too real for me, which in a way is a credit to the filmmaking in this film, that it is very effective at creating suspense.
Yeah, I mean, that scenario, we should feel uncomfortable,
Right.
I didn't feel like it was too gratuitous. I've seen movies where something like that happens and the movie is just wallowing in it. And this movie does not wallow in anything. I mean, even the violence.
It does move on.
It does.
It does move on.
I mean, even the violence. I mean, the violence is occasionally, it looks painful, but the movie this is not a gore fest by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, there's one part where she injures her leg, I think.
Yeah,
that is also another moment.
She steps on a root and has to pull it out. But again, the focus on that is less about like we're going to show you something really gory and being like, what would this feel like? And you have somebody after you and you have to get this out of your foot as quickly as possible. I found it thrilling pretty much from start to finish. And again, it's basically no frills in a lot of ways, and it's nothing that I don't think audiences if you've seen enough thrillers or horror films, you've seen variations on this before. I was just there's just something like Spartan about its brutality and about its efficiency that I really, really appreciated.
Yeah, and it is efficient and brutal. Like, both those words definitely apply. But I think you made a good point in that the shot of the foot injury we were talking about, it is about putting yourself in her shoes. Yeah. And I think that the film does do a good job of showing this scenario from her point of view and making you want to root for her.
Totally. I also think the ending is extremely satisfying.
It is.
I won't say anything more about that, but the ending is very satisfying.
It is. Like, I would give this movie a recommendation just with a soft warning, if you're really sensitive to violence against women, there are some uncomfortable moments.
For sure.
That's all we've got for you this week. Just a note, The Possessor will be out on VOD on November 3rd, and His House hits Netflix next weekend. The rest of the films that we discussed today are all out on digital platforms in one capacity or another, either streaming or VOD. In the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced and edited by Carl Blumberg. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer. And our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. And tune in next week for the final installment of our month-long Halloween series. Katie and I are returning to the Premise Dome to argue the merits of two classic werewolf movies that came out the same year. I won't tell you which ones, you'll just have to tune in to find out. Until then, thanks for listening.